Yes, my old friend, I've come to talk with you again. Everybody is on. Shot, 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 shot. But I will go down with this shit. And I won't put my hands up and surrender. What have I become, my sweetest friend?
Oh, hi. Yeah, I forgot it was a short week this week. I'm gonna brush my teeth and change of clothes. I'll be right back. Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 4. Things got a bit rough last week, and it was a good reminder that the NFL is very, very unpredictable week to week. There's plenty to talk about regarding last week's flop. Literally everything went wrong that could have gone wrong for the Vikings. But this stupid video series of mine is about reviewing beers and previewing upcoming games. So I'll only talk about the Bills game as much as I need to put this week's matchup in perspective. Speaking of this week's matchup, the Vikings have the Rams, and the beer I'll be trying is the Viking Lettre. Uh, it's their light beer. You know, I could say something cute about Thursday night lights, or how you gotta drink light beer on weeknights since the Thursday night game, something like that. But really, I just saved it because it's blue and white like the Rams, and it's got the curlies on it like their helmets. That's why. So this is an Icelandic light beer, Letur og Mildur Bjór. I'm really curious to try this because the first two, weeks 1 and 2, when I was reading about the beers and kind of what they're known for, the descriptions that Viking puts out, they said that they're lighter than your standard lager, and week three's was much heavier. But neither of those beers was actually a light beer, whereas this is their light beer. So I'm curious how much lighter. Let's crack it open. Here we are. So as you can see, it is indeed very light, a very light golden color, kind of what I expect from a standard light beer. I read that it was supposed to be served iced cold, so I put it in the freezer for a bit to make sure I got it as cold as possible without getting it slushy. Let's give it a taste. Yeah, that's very light. Very light on the tongue. I would compare it to a lot of domestic light beers, I suppose. I don't have much to say about the flavor. It's I would just say it's very light. It's very refreshing. It seems to be a good beer to drink on a hot day. Not a lot of flavor to it though, which is fine. It reminds me of like a Coors. You know, it's inoffensive. I could see drinking several of these. I mean, especially if the game turns south. Because I didn't have much to say about the flavor itself, I thought I should mention some facts about the beer. It's brewed using a special process that means there's almost like no residual sugar left in it after the fermentation process or brewing process. And it's got 4.4% alcohol by volume. All in all, a very good beer. All right, on to tonight's game. Well, after Sunday's shellacking at the hands of the Bills, the Vikings have a lot to worry about this week. The big concern coming into this year that I heard from people was that the offensive line could be a problem again. In 2016, they were the most injured offensive line, I think, in the league, or they were at least up there. And that led to kind of a blowout of a season. Last season, 2017, when the Vikings made their deep postseason run, they had like the healthiest and most consistent offensive line in football. And it mattered. It showed. This year, they are very shallow at offensive line. They have tons of injuries, and even like the starters are maybe not up to the average that you'd want in the league. An interesting statistic that I saw from Sam Monson of Pro Football Focus said that the league average tends to be about 10 pressures allowed on a team's quarterback, and Riley Reef and I can't remember the other guy now, but the two offensive linemen for the Vikings alone allowed 20 pressures. That would explain why Kirk Cousins has been constantly under siege this year, and the rushing attack and passing attack have both been constantly disrupted. In week two, many Viking fans were abuzz about how we had this quarterback who could, make the crazy throws at the end of the game, who could bring us back from a deficit when we were playing the Packers, and that was legitimate. I mean, he looked like the kind of quarterback that could keep you in a game, can make those big comebacks. But last week, I mean, everything was awful, and I can't pin it on him alone. He maybe held on to it a little too long a couple times, but when you're getting pressured that much, you're in for a world of hurt. And if the Vikings look that inept against the Buffalo Buck and Phils, I'm terrified for tonight's game in Los Angeles. The Rams have a super staunch defense, even with their secondary banged up. Both Aqib Talib and Marcus Peters are out tonight, but they will constantly be facing pressure because on the Rams' defensive line they have Ndamukong Suh and Aaron Donald. Yeesh. It will be interesting to see if the Vikings can generate any more offense than they did last week, which admittedly is not saying much. On the other side of the ball, the Vikings have been a defensive power for several years, and the Rams were the number one scoring offense in the league last year. However, when the Eagles dismantled the Vikings in the NFC Championship game last year, there began to be some concern that the league had figured out the flaws in Mike Zimmer's defense, and if not the scheme itself, at least the players that play in that scheme. And it certainly seems possible, considering in week one, George Kittle, the tight end for the 49ers, got deep and was like potentially could have had a 150-plus yard game if he hadn't dropped a couple passes. In week two, the Packers tight end Jimmy Graham and Devontae Adams and Geronimo Allison all had big games. And then last week, Chris Ivory, the running back, and backup or second string tight end Jason Kroom got wide open. If the Vikings defense has indeed been cracked by some of the league's coaches, I'm terrified of what could happen against one of the league's best minds, Rams head coach Sean McVay. On a short week, on the road, 2 time zones to the west, against the highest scoring offense, against a staunch defense, with a banged up offensive line, against the sharpest coach in the game. I just don't imagine things going well for the Vikings this week. I predict the Vikings get down early, with Kirk Cousins being required again to throw lots of passes, leading to a fairly high scoring affair, but the Vikings ultimately will fall short and falling to 1-2-1 on the season. But I thought the Vikings would decimate the Bills last week as much as I think the Rams are going to beat the Vikings this week, and I was super wrong about one of them, so possibly I'll be wrong about both of them. And to add insult to injury, I believe the Packers will very comfortably handle the Bills at home at Lambeau this week. I might need more than just the one light beer. Let's hope I'm wrong. Skål filether. Go Vikings.